I've been on this bench for a long time, and I've learned that the hardest cases aren't always the ones with the most complex legal issues. Sometimes the hardest cases are the ones where you have to look someone powerful in the eye and tell them that their child isn't above the law. This is one of those cases, and it's one that nearly cost me everything. It was a Monday morning in March, and I remember the weather was miserable. Cold rain, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you want to stay in bed. But I was in court by 8 o'clock like always, going through my docket for the day. Most of it was routine stuff, traffic violations, small disputes, nothing that stood out as particularly difficult. Then my clerk came in and her face was pale. She handed me a file and told me I needed to look at it immediately. The case involved a hit-and-run accident that had occurred 3 nights prior, on Friday evening around 11 p.m. A vehicle had struck a pedestrian on Broad Street and fled the scene. The victim was a 17-year-old girl named Jessica Morales. She'd been walking home from her job at a diner where she worked to help support her family. The impact had thrown her 30 feet. She'd suffered a traumatic brain injury, multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, and she was currently in a coma at Rhode Island Hospital. The doctor said even if she survived, she'd likely never be the same. The driver had been identified through security camera footage and witness statements. His name was Trevor Brennan. He was 19 years old. And his father was Chief of Police Thomas Brennan, the man who'd run the Providence Police Department for the past 12 years. I sat back in my chair and I felt my stomach drop. Thomas Brennan was one of the most powerful men in Providence. He had connections everywhere, political influence, and a reputation for protecting his own. This wasn't just going to be a legal case, this was going to be a war. Trevor was being charged with hit and run resulting in serious bodily injury, driving under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident. If convicted on all counts, he was looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. But he'd been released on bail within hours of his arrest, and word around the courthouse was that Chief Brennan was already working every angle to make this case disappear. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. I knew it was going to be packed, media circus, political pressure, all of it. I spent my lunch hour in my chambers reading through every document, every piece of evidence, preparing myself for what was coming. At 2 p.m., the courtroom was standing room only. News cameras lined the back wall. I saw city councilors, state representatives, people from the police union, and right in the front row sat Chief Thomas Brennan, wearing his dress uniform, his chest covered in medals and commendations. He was a big man, intimidating, with gray hair cut military short and eyes that could bore holes through steel. Next to him sat his wife, a thin woman who looked like she'd been crying for days. Trevor was brought in, and he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a scared kid. Tall and athletic, probably played football in high school, with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes. He was wearing an expensive suit, clearly bought for this occasion, and he kept glancing back at his parents like he was looking for reassurance that everything would be okay. The prosecution was being handled by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Kim, a sharp woman in her 40s who'd never backed down from a difficult case. She laid out the evidence methodically. Security footage showed Trevor's vehicle, a black BMW registered to his father, speeding down Broad Street at approximately 70 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the vehicle swerve, strike Jessica Morales, and continue driving without stopping. Police had found the BMW parked in the Brennan family's garage 3 hours later. The front end was damaged, there was blood on the bumper, and a piece of Jessica's jacket caught in the grill. Trevor had been located at a friend's house. His blood alcohol level was still .12, well over the legal limit, 6 hours after the accident. He'd initially denied being the driver, claimed someone must have stolen his car, but his story fell apart under questioning. Rachel showed photos of Jessica in the hospital. A beautiful girl with long, dark hair now shaved for surgery, her head wrapped in bandages, tubes and machines keeping her alive. She showed photos of the impact site, blood on the pavement, Jessica's shoe lying in the street. She showed the damage to the BMW, the physical evidence that couldn't be denied. Then it was the defense's turn. Trevor's lawyer was Marcus Webb, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in New England. He stood up and immediately began attacking the evidence. He claimed the security footage was inconclusive, that you couldn't definitively identify the driver. He argued that the blood alcohol test was inadmissible because Trevor hadn't been read his rights properly. He suggested that someone else could have been driving the BMW, that Trevor was being railroaded because of his father's position. It was all nonsense, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. But Marcus was good at his job, and he was planting seeds of doubt, building a framework for reasonable doubt that he'd exploit in a full trial. When Marcus sat down, I looked at Trevor and asked him if he wanted to make a statement. His lawyer immediately advised him not to speak, but Trevor stood up anyway. His voice was shaking when he said he wanted to tell the truth. His lawyer tried to stop him, but Trevor ignored him. He said yes, he'd been driving the BMW that night. Yes, he'd been drinking at a friend's party. Yes, he'd been driving too fast. He said he'd seen Jessica step off the curb. He'd tried to swerve, but he was going too fast and he hit her. He said the sound of the impact would haunt him for the rest of his life. But then he said something that made the entire courtroom gasp. He said his father had told him to run. After the impact, Trevor had panicked, pulled over a block away, called his father, and Chief Brennan had told him to leave the scene, to come straight home, that he would handle it. Trevor said he'd been terrified, in shock, and he'd done what his father told him to do. He'd driven home, parked the BMW in the garage, and then his father had driven him to a friend's house and told him to stay there and say nothing to anyone. Chief Brennan jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. He shouted that Trevor was lying, that he was confused, that the trauma of the accident had messed with his memory. But Trevor kept talking. He said his father had spent the hours after the accident trying to cover it up, calling in favors, pressuring witnesses, trying to make the evidence disappear. He said his father had told him that they could beat this, that Brennan men didn't go to prison, that everything would be fine. But Trevor said it wasn't fine. Jessica Morales was dying because of him, and lying about it, hiding from it, wasn't going to change that. He said he deserved to be punished, that his father's position shouldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. The courtroom erupted. Reporters were shouting questions. Chief Brennan was screaming at his son. Marcus Webb looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I had to bang my gavel repeatedly to restore order. When things finally calmed down, I looked at Chief Brennan and asked him if what Trevor said was true. Had he instructed his son to flee the scene? Had he attempted to obstruct the investigation? Chief Brennan stood there, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He could deny it, claim his son was lying or confused. But Trevor's confession had been so specific, so detailed, that denial would be hard to maintain. And if he lied now, under oath, he'd be adding perjury to obstruction of justice. He made a choice. He said yes. Yes, he'd told Trevor to leave the scene. But he claimed it was panic, father's instinct to protect his child. He said when Trevor called him hysterical and saying he'd hit someone, his first thought wasn't about the law, it was about his son. He said he'd made a mistake, acted on emotion rather than duty, but he'd never intended to obstruct justice. I sat there listening to this man, this chief of police who was supposed to uphold the law, admit that he'd helped his son flee the scene of a serious accident and then spent hours trying to cover it up. And I knew that what I did next would define the rest of my career, possibly the rest of my life. I denied bail for Trevor. I ruled that given his father's position and demonstrated willingness to interfere with the investigation, Trevor posed a flight risk. He would remain in custody pending trial. The courtroom exploded again. Chief Brennan was shouting about how I was destroying his family, how I'd regret this decision, how he had friends who would make sure I never sat on a bench again. I had Chief Brennan removed from the courtroom for contempt. A chief of police removed from my courtroom for threatening a judge. It made headlines across the state within hours. But I wasn't done. I ordered the district attorney to open an investigation into Chief Brennan's conduct. If he'd obstructed justice, if he'd used his position to interfere with the investigation, he needed to be held accountable just like anyone else would be. The next 3 months were hell. I received death threats. My car was vandalized. Someone spray-painted "corrupt judge" across my garage door. The police union called for my removal from the bench. City councilors who owed Chief Brennan favors demanded investigations into my conduct. Articles appeared questioning my competence, my bias, my fitness to serve. My family was terrified. My wife begged me to recuse myself from the case, to let another judge handle it, to protect our family from the fallout. But I couldn't do that. If I backed down, if I let power and influence determine justice, then what was the point of any of this? What was the point of the law if it only applied to people without connections? The investigation into Chief Brennan moved quickly. Once Trevor had opened the door with his confession, other officers started coming forward. Turned out this wasn't the first time the chief had interfered with cases involving his family or friends. There were traffic tickets that had disappeared, DUI arrests that had been dropped, evidence that had mysteriously gone missing. For years, Chief Brennan had been running the police department like his personal protection service. He was arrested 6 weeks after Trevor's preliminary hearing, charged with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, tampering with evidence, and a list of other offenses. He resigned from the police department in disgrace. The man who'd been one of the most powerful figures in Providence was now facing prison time. Trevor's trial began in June. Marcus Webb had withdrawn from the case, citing attorney-client privilege given Trevor's confession. Trevor's new lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, tried to paint Trevor as a victim of his father's influence, but Trevor wouldn't let him. In a rare move, Trevor fired his lawyer and represented himself with a public defender as standby counsel. He pled guilty to all charges. He didn't want a trial, didn't want to put Jessica's family through testimony and cross-examination. He stood in front of me and said he took full responsibility for his actions. He said he'd been drunk, reckless, and cowardly. He said that fleeing the scene, listening to his father instead of his conscience, was something he'd regret for the rest of his life. Jessica's family was in the courtroom. Her mother, father, and 2 younger siblings. Jessica was no longer in a coma, but the doctors had been right about the damage. She had severe cognitive impairments, couldn't walk without assistance, couldn't speak clearly. The bright, ambitious girl who dreamed of going to college and becoming a teacher would now need round-the-clock care for the rest of her life. Jessica's mother stood to give a victim impact statement. She talked about her daughter's dreams, her kindness, her work ethic. She talked about how Jessica had worked at that diner to save money for college, how she'd studied late into the night, how she'd helped her younger siblings with their homework. She talked about the Jessica they'd lost that night on Broad Street and the shell of a person who remained. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said she didn't hate Trevor. She was angry, devastated, broken by what he'd done, but she didn't hate him. She said what she hated was the system that had almost let him get away with it. She said if Trevor had been her son, if he'd been poor, if he'd been a person of color without connections, he would have been arrested immediately. There wouldn't have been any calls made, any favors called in, any attempts to make evidence disappear. She looked right at me and said she was grateful. Grateful that I'd had the courage to treat Trevor like anyone else would be treated. She said justice wasn't about revenge, it was about equality under the law. And for once, a powerful person's child was being held accountable the same way hers would have been. I sentenced Trevor to 15 years in prison. It was the maximum I could give under the sentencing guidelines, and I made it clear why. Not just because of the severity of the injuries to Jessica, but because of his flight from the scene, his initial lies, and his father's attempted cover-up. I said that wealth and power had protected him for the first 19 years of his life, but they wouldn't protect him anymore. Chief Brennan's trial was shorter. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. A decorated police chief sent to prison for obstruction of justice and abuse of power. It sent shockwaves through law enforcement across the state. But the story doesn't end there, because the most important part came later. I started getting letters from Trevor. At first, I didn't read them. It's not appropriate for a judge to have correspondence with someone they've sentenced. But my clerk convinced me to at least look at the first one. Trevor wrote that he was attending every educational program the prison offered. He'd gotten his GED, started taking college courses through a distance learning program. But more importantly, he'd started volunteering for a program that brought speakers into the prison to talk to at-risk youth about the consequences of drunk driving. He wrote about standing in front of teenagers and telling them his story, about being the police chief's son who thought he was invincible, about making the choice to drink and drive, about the sound of the impact, about Jessica's face on the pavement, about his father telling him to run and him being too cowardly to do the right thing. He said the kids listened to him in a way they didn't listen to their teachers or their parents. Because he wasn't some authority figure lecturing them, he was a cautionary tale. He was proof that one bad decision could destroy multiple lives. But the letter that really got to me came about 2 years into his sentence. Trevor wrote that Jessica's mother had come to visit him. I couldn't believe it. The mother of the girl he'd nearly killed had driven to the prison to see him. He said she'd told him that she'd been following his efforts, that she'd heard about his speaking to youth groups, and she wanted him to know something. She said that what happened to Jessica was a tragedy that couldn't be undone. But she believed in redemption. She believed that people could change, could become better than their worst moment. She told Trevor that Jessica, before the accident, had been studying criminal justice. She'd wanted to work with at-risk youth, to help prevent kids from making the same mistakes her own cousins had made. Jessica's mother said that if Trevor was serious about change, If he was genuinely trying to prevent other kids from making his mistakes, then in some small way he was carrying on Jessica's dream. He was doing the work she would have done if she'd been able to. Trevor wrote that he'd broken down crying in that visiting room. This woman whose daughter he'd destroyed had given him something he didn't think he deserved: forgiveness. Not absolution, not a free pass, but the possibility of redemption. She'd told him that the best way to honor Jessica was to save other Jessicas from drivers like the person he used to be. Trevor served 11 years of his 15-year sentence. He was released early for good behavior and for his work with the Youth Intervention Program. When he got out, Jessica's mother helped him get a job at a non-profit organization that works with at-risk youth. He now travels to high schools across New England telling his story, showing pictures of Jessica before and after the accident, talking about the real cost of drunk driving. The organization he works for created a scholarship in Jessica's name. It's funded partially by Trevor's salary, which he voluntarily had garnished by 50% to support the scholarship. Every year they give a full college scholarship to a student who demonstrates commitment to community service and helping others. Jessica is still alive. She requires constant care and she'll never recover the life she should have had. But her family tells me she smiles when they tell her about the scholarship recipients, about the work being done in her name. They believe she understands, in whatever way she can, that something good has come from something terrible. Chief Brennan served 6 years of his 8-year sentence. When he was released, he moved to Florida. I heard he became a security consultant, though I don't know if that's true. We never spoke again after his sentencing. His wife divorced him while he was in prison. The last I heard, Trevor has no relationship with his father. He told a reporter once that his father taught him everything about power and privilege, but it was his victim's mother who taught him about grace and redemption. I still think about that case all the time. People ask me if I ever regretted it, if the threats and the pressure and the political fallout were worth it. My answer is always the same. That case was the easiest decision I ever made. A young woman was nearly killed and someone needed to be held accountable. It didn't matter who his father was. It didn't matter what connections he had. The law is supposed to be blind to those things. What made that case hard wasn't the legal decision. It was everything that came after. The realization that our system is so broken that a judge following the law becomes a controversial figure. The knowledge that if I hadn't been secure in my position, if I'd been up for re-election or dependent on political appointments, I might have faced pressure I couldn't resist. But I also learned something important from that case. I learned that real justice isn't just about punishment. It's about the possibility of change. Trevor Brennan committed a terrible crime. He was a privileged kid who thought his father's badge would protect him from consequences. But when he was finally forced to face those consequences, when he was shown that he wasn't above the law, something changed in him. I don't know if Trevor is a good person now. I don't know if he's truly redeemed or if he's just going through the motions. But I know that hundreds of teenagers have heard his story and made different choices. I know that scholarship recipients are going to college who might not have otherwise. I know that Jessica's mother found a way to create meaning from tragedy. And I know that in Providence, Rhode Island, there's now a precedent. The chief of police's son went to prison for his crimes. A powerful man who tried to obstruct justice was held accountable. It sent a message that the law applies to everyone, regardless of their last name or their connections or their father's position. That's what justice looks like. Not perfect, not always satisfying, but equal. That case tested everything I believed about the law, about fairness, about courage. And I'd like to think that in the end we got it right. Not because Trevor went to prison, but because Jessica's family saw that the system could work, that power doesn't always win, that sometimes courage and principle can overcome influence and corruption. I keep a photo on my desk now. It's from the last scholarship ceremony. Trevor is there, standing next to Jessica's mother, and they're presenting the award to a young woman who wants to be a social worker. They're both smiling, and I think about how many other victims would love to have that opportunity, to find meaning in their tragedy but can't because the people who hurt them were never held accountable. That photo reminds me why this job matters, why these decisions matter, why we can never let power and privilege determine justice.